Hello and welcome to the Traction Sim Racing podcast with the Toms, a special Sim Sundays episode with an interesting guest, Tom.
Yeah, very interesting guest. It was somebody who I've heard a lot, but I have to admit I'd actually never seen what they looked like until a very short period of time before the episode. They have an iconic voice, which is a clue. There's really no point in giving clues because the thumbnail of this episode will have
people have pressed on the episode.
That's the title. I don't know. I'm still trying to keep it a secret. It was Alex Jacques, which was surreal. It was an iconic voice to speak to, and a great story. Yeah, we spoke about his commentary career, obviously, but also his affinity with sim racing and sim racing commentary. I tried to make it a little less generic and more focusing on sim racing because, of course, he did the F1 Esports, as it would have been called back then, and has commentated on some of the iconic Jarno Opmeer moments from F1 sim racing. So yeah, it was an interesting conversation. We got into a right flow, and we did go on for quite a long time, which is generous because he's a busy guy.
It's a really insightful and interesting and entertaining episode. I don't want to blow too much smoke your way, Tom, but it's the best one yet.
It was mainly him making it interesting. Let's be fair.
No, team effort, and it goes to show for anybody who is in maybe like sim racing commentary or league commentary that hard work does pay off. And he has some sage advice to those who want to maybe make the step into real world or do a bit of both, and also. Just selfishly, I'm an unabashed fan. He's my favourite Formula 1 commentator. For me, he is the voice of F1. In the UK where we are, people may know him from the Channel 4 commentary, so if you pay for Sky, you don't get Alex Jacques. But around the world, he's the voice of the popular F1 TV subscription service. And also, you can hear his voice in the video games. And I think he's the most eloquent commentator as well, right? And not in a highfalutin way, but in a way that's still relatable, and he doesn't go down these rabbit holes of, oh, what's this theory? This might happen. When he's not a driver, he's happy to, as he discussed, lean on his co-commentators who have Formula 1 experience.
Well, it was clear that you were a huge fan because in the lead up to all these episodes, we do a bit of joint research, and I have to admit, it was an incredibly busy week, and all of the research was basically done by you. And I imagine you didn't have to Google much. You just knew it, and it was it was incredible. I was able to pick out some key points from some of his commentary, and I also lent on some of the questions that were sent in by our community. Unsurprisingly, we had lots and lots and lots of you sending us questions for Alex Jacques, and they were all great, and I was trying to kind of bundle some of them together so that we could cover as much of it as possible. And remember, if you want to join in the conversation and send in your questions before each of the recordings we do with our guests, join the TraxionGG Discord by clicking on the Discord logo at the top of TraxionGG or going to traxion.gg/Discord. Or just follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc., where we pre-announce our guests and ask for your questions. As always, thank you to our podcast partner, Elgato. Still have tons and tons and tons of their stuff in our studio that we are yet to put together. So looking forward to that. And thank you to you for listening. We've been really enjoying these podcasts. We've brought them back. We brought back the TraxionGG podcast, and I brought back the Sim Sundays podcast, and we've melded them in together. And we had our first kind of news podcast last week. I don't know about you, Tom, but I've been enjoying being back.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and we have a few irons in the fire soon. So please subscribe on YouTube or follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify for plenty more. And any feedback on our pilot news episode that we're going to do once a month. But also any comments, please put them on the website or YouTube about Alex's career, because for me, he comes from a journalism background and doing lots of voluntary work, and I think that's a good template to follow if you really are passionate. So anyway, enough of that now. I think it's probably time to listen to your amazing interview. Oh man.
Alex, welcome to Sim Sundays. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the chat.
So am I, and so are our community. We were just chatting about the commentators that we have within the Grid Finder and Traction sphere, and there's so many people who are excited to hear this interview and hear about your story, especially because you commentate not only on Formula One, which is pretty big, but also sim racing. I was watching the race at COTA in 2022 for the F1 Esports Day, and you went absolutely nuts at that last lap where Jarno Opmeer overtakes right at the end. Is it safe to say that you're a fan of sim racing?
Without doubt. I think one of the nice things that I've been commentating for 10 years now on racing, whichever form it may take. And one of the nice things about it is that I've got to almost have this bonus experience of being involved in this community. And I know that there are so many different levels to it. There's so many broadcasts, so many streams, so many leagues. It's a really multifaceted sector that I really had very little right to be part of, but it's been a wonderful thing to be involved. And yeah, I've enjoyed it, as you can hear on that last lap. That's probably my favorite race that I've done.
Okay, picked a good
one in that sphere when it comes to the sim sector, and it just, because it's always close, especially with F1 Esports, it's always close. But in those moments, the adrenaline is pumping. I mean, yeah, that is the experience of being a commentator that you want. You want a close finish where you don't know who's going to win on the last lap. That's the definition of why anyone picks up a microphone in the first place. So that's a great example of how fun it has been to commentate on F1 Esports.
Well, that's really interesting, and I usually save all the community questions until the end. But just to pick up on something you said there about you love it when it gets really exciting and the adrenaline starts flowing. We had a question from a member of our community and an influencer himself, I guess. Dave Cam does a lot of iRacing streaming. He said, "Does Alex like the racing to be frantic, where he never stops to the point he can't take a breath? Or do you prefer it to be spread out so you can read stats and backstories and bring in commentators, etc.?"
Well, the great thing about it is that you're always going to get a mixture. So you are always going to get everything described in that question. Great question. I love the finishes to be frantic, if I'm honest. Yeah, I love it to build to a crescendo because none of that enthusiasm is forced. I love close racing. I've loved close racing since I was 10 years old. I will love it, just before my dying breath. And it doesn't really matter what form it takes. I've been very lucky to commentate on loads of different sport and loads of different motorsport. If it's a frantic finish, that's great. But it is nice to have the ebb and flow. I'd say that, taking a step back, one of the great things about it is the combination. That sometimes you can get a great race where the finish not bails out the race, but you can tell a load of narrative, and then you get an amazing finish.
So it's really interesting that you said that. And honestly, my plan for this interview is totally out the window now because you've just raised another point. So I was watching the Monaco, where Charles Leclerc wins at Monaco, and it's not an exciting end, right? He's miles ahead of everyone else. He's well down the road. And so you start telling a story about Charles Leclerc, and you kind of bring in the context and you kind of make it more exciting because you remind the audience why it's important that Charles is winning, and you tell a little story about how he kind of tells a white lie to his dad about him getting an F1 contract. And so, in that last moment, there isn't like a wheel-to-wheel battle going through the last couple of corners, but I guess you have to do enough research before a race to be able to make any moment interesting to the viewer. So to that end, how much planning research do you have to do before these races so that you've always got something like that in your back pocket if there isn't a battle?
Yeah, so there's two different things there. Number one, you always do your research. Your research is your safety net, and your research is the thing that is always going to make sure that your broadcast never dips below a certain standard. That is why you do it. That is why a lot of the prep you will never touch. It's that, there are no bad things about the job, but a lot of the prep you will never touch. So, but you've got to do it, because if you Monaco is a great example. Sometimes you are reaching for story rather than describing wheel-to-wheel action because of the nature of the circuit. With Charles, it was slightly different because I commentated on his career through the junior levels from 2016 in the third tier to being a thrilling F2 champion to his impressive rookie season where he's making Q3s that he arguably shouldn't have, and then his journey with Ferrari. So that was more of a summation of what I understood about his character. And that's a very unusual situation, that, because it was a real gear change. Because as you point out, not a lot went on in that Grand Prix after the opening lap. But the thought that went into it was, I go out with Jolyon and David in that commentary box to such a broad audience that, and we have so many new fans in recent years, my thought was, you could be casually coming to this as a new fan and not know the backstory. That's my job to tell you the backstory. You could be watching it on Channel 4, having flicked through the channels, and you're like, oh, a Monaco kid's going to win the Monaco Grand Prix. Your job in that moment is to go, I need to tell you the context. I need to tell you why this is important. I need to tell you why he's going to be so emotional when he wins it. That's the apex of the job. Everyone can see that a red Ferrari has won. Everyone can see that he's won his home race. What can't you see? That's the job of the commentator, because that's the narrative that I wanted to upend the expectation of a rich kid wins his home Grand Prix for the people who didn't know. And I think even if you were a massive fan and you knew his story, maybe you didn't know just quite how much he's had to deal with at such a young age, and how he's risen to the top in Formula One whilst dealing with some really tough emotional stuff. So that's why that last lap was how I delivered it.
And has that sliding scale between telling the story of the race, so sector times, tire wear, fuel usage, etc., versus the pure story of the people, or the human story that's involved within racing, has that sliding scale shifted since the Drive to Survive series came out? And as you said, a broader audience has started to embrace F1.
I certainly recapped the basics a lot more than I did. Yeah, I went to go and went to have a meeting with F1's audience team, and they showed me some data about where the fan base was. So I think in 2017, when I was doing the odd, 2017, 2018, when I was doing the odd radio race or a race for a smaller audience for a FOM internal broadcast or something like that, I might not recap the rules of qualifying every single time I go on air. I do that now, and then it's my task to smuggle that in a way that doesn't get an avid fan to roll their eyes. Has the balance shifted? Probably in reminding everyone of the almost your starter pack information a little bit. The rest of it is the same editorial judgment that it's always been. What is the most important thing for the viewer to know in this moment? So sometimes it's about a fastest middle sector, but sometimes it might be about the teammates' head-to-head battle. Sometimes it might be trying to save their drive for the next season. There's always a hierarchy of information that needs to be imparted. And so that doesn't really change with the new booming audience of recent years.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the cliches that always gets told is about how, commentating is just storytelling. And I always think back to kind of learning English literature at school, where you have to learn the story inside out and know the nuances and know the various different layers of it. But then I was always rubbish in exams because I could never remember the quotes. I have a terrible memory for details, dates, and exactly what people said when. And I guess with commentary, you can mitigate that by doing your research. But when you're in the moment and the adrenaline's flowing, how much do you have to rely on memory of all of these various constituent parts of the ecosystem of the race series that you're commentating on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I rely on it a lot. In all honesty, we had McLaren earlier this year, probably prompted by your background there, that's made me think of this. But a perfect example is that we had a situation whereby Lando Norris is in the lead, Oscar Piastri's behind. They've gone super cautious to protect against Lewis Hamilton with the strategy. It means that Lando's come out in front. Lando is then asked to give the place back, and then spends a large part of the end of the race mulling whether to do that, which is a situation that I happen to know that David Coulthard had been in his career.
Good.
And I happen to know that off the top of my head. So there's no prep we could do. It was a weirdly similar situation in that DC moved out of the way for his teammate Mika Häkkinen. Mika Häkkinen then wins his first race, changed the dynamic in their McLaren team forever. Lando's in an identical situation, and I was able to press DC on whether he would do something differently with that. That is entirely, as you say, from memory. That is entirely because I remember and I know the context, and it's a little bit of going back and knowing your craft. And I'm not saying that you need to know, what happened in the Dutch Grand Prix in the mid-'80s, but equally, if you are going to hold the microphone for a championship, you're going to need to know the experiences of certainly who you're with in the box in encyclopedic detail, because you might get a race where you can draw out the exact real-time analysis of, and the amazing thing, DC moved over in 1997 when asked to by the team. He said in 2024 he wouldn't do it again if he was given another go. And that told the audience exactly what Lando was going through in that moment. So yeah, some of it's from memory, some of it's from research. I didn't watch, I started watching Formula One in 1998. The incident we're talking about is from 1997. So that is going back and looking at the craft and looking at the backstory. So yeah, it's a combination of the two, but I am very fortunate in that Formula One has been my favorite thing since I was 10 years old. Motor racing is my favorite thing, and I therefore have a lot of it in the memory bank, some useless stuff which will never be helpful, but yeah, sometimes it's a real advantage in the situation I described.
And I remember I watched the race highlights and listened to that conversation, and yeah, that was interesting, bringing it to life, because you that kind of immediate comparison of somebody saying, well, I wouldn't do that again, and I've been there and I've done it. That was fascinating. And to try and bring this back to sim racing, right? Because I always do this. We have to focus on sim racing, but this is such a fascinating topic that I don't think anybody listening will mind us discussing. But I suppose in sim racing, there's an unusual difference in that 99% of commentators can say that within the context of sim racers that they are also drivers, and you wouldn't necessarily get that balance when commentating on the real world of race. And there's usually one driver and then two kind of non-drivers, if you like, or people who haven't driven to the same level in the same series. Now, I'm wondering if that's a risk for sim racing commentators, that they're all drivers, and so that they might lose an element of the story from an outside perspective. So I'm interested to know how you change your style if you do or don't have a driver in the box with you.
That's a really good question. I think if you don't have a driver with you in the box, you don't give opinions. I always think it's really important and people, if people who want to commentate in the future are listening to this, please do it your way. My way was always, I am not going to chuck out opinions if I've got proven top level people next to me, because that is ridiculous from an editorial point of view. I know other broadcasters, people that I consider friends, who completely feel the other way about that. And that's fine. And you have to do it. It's one of the most important lessons. You have to do it your way. So you're always going to have to work with a production team, and they're going to have direction for you. But you have to be authentic to, you can't be chucking out hot takes if that's not what you're like. That's not what I'm like. I'd much rather hear from David Coulthard and Jolyon Palmer about what they think and rely and draw out their experience. But if they're not there, then you probably take a broader approach. You probably take a broader view. You might pose questions to the audience. You might rely on your own experience and try and think of anecdotes from racing that you've called in the past to provide context to maybe a controversial moment that you wouldn't do if you had a driver to sling it across to, like I do with Coulthard, Palmer, Alex Brundle on a regular basis. So yeah, it does change the approach if you're not with drivers, but I think being authentic is the overarching thing there. And Yeah, to be authentic with your sound and to editorially do things that you're comfortable with, I think is the path to improving as a commentator.
It makes so much sense, right? Doubling down on your own strengths and your own USPs. Now, all the commentators, sim racing commentators listening to this, the common theme within the questions is, how do I get where you are, right? And it's probably a question you get asked a lot. So it'd be interesting to go back and kind of recap your journey, because you started in local BBC sports coverage and then obviously took over from Will Buxton at what was then GP2. And now, I guess there's an important distinction to make that you commentate for F1 TV, so the F1 World feed, not just the Channel 4 feed. Yeah. And you haven't dropped GP2 or F2, right? So you have it. So you do 2 series during a weekend, which is probably an unusual career path to go through in F1. So it'd be great to hear, your story about how you've ended up with this mishmash.
Yeah. So, as a wider point of view, one of the things that has changed is the route that you take through. I think that, and I think especially sim racing, has provided, this is one of the things I really like about it, it's provided a chance for so many people to try their hand to see whether they've got the knack, the rhythm, the feel for broadcasting and commentary. And I love that about the entire community. I think it's fantastic. And I think long term, if you look across the next few decades, I think we're going to get different voices as a result of that being a pathway. My pathway was more traditional, probably one of the last pathways to take this route, if I'm honest, because of the way media as a whole has gone. BBC local radio, a sports agency that would send me around to sometimes do written reports, sometimes film press conferences, and then always being the person available for BBC local radio. Can you go to Cardiff with 1 day's notice? You're going to make a loss on it, but you're going to get a whole football match that you're then going to be able to edit the best bits down into, so that should Will Buxton ever give up GP3 and GP2, you'll have a tight show reel to send a producer. It's as simple as that. That process that I've just condensed down was 4 or 5 years that I was taking BBC local radio gigs, sports agency gigs, and it comes with sacrifice. It comes with missing birthdays and anniversaries, and sometimes you're covering a boring 0-0 and it's not going to be useful for that end goal, but you still learn things with that experience, and you meet other people doing the job, and you see how someone deals with a manager being incredibly rude to a question, and you see how they deal with it and absorb it, and you're learning all the time. And the learning all the time bit is the thing that applies from the old to the new. You will come across people who are going to try and help your career, give you good advice, try and move you forward. And there are people who will be competitive with you. So I then had an opportunity to join the Times newspaper, which took my focus slightly away, but I still would spend 1 day of my weekend covering some sport, because it's what I always wanted to do. And then I was able to send 4 years worth of BBC local radio and YouTube commentaries and sports agency work to Formula One management and say, I understand you've got a vacancy, here's how I sound, and then making sure that I had a chance to pitch to them. And this answers your question. It's a long, rambly answer, but you got a commentator on, so you knew what you're in for.
It's a long, rambly journey.
It's a long, rambly journey. So I said to them, I will treat F2 like you treat F1. That was part of my pitch to get in the door. I think if you say that to two people that then give you keys to a job that can change your life, you then have to honor what you said. And I was really, really clear to them that I desperately wanted to continue with Formula 2 when I got the chance to do Formula 1. And that's why I still do it. I love it. It's a great group of people that I work with. The championship is very special to me. It's some of the best motor racing on earth. And and that was part of my pitch to get in the door back in end of 2014 and start of 2015. So that's why. That's why I did it.
And in the same vein, is it fair to say that you treat F1 Esports as it was, or F1 sim racing now, or let's say sim racing generally, with the same reverence that you treat F1? Is it? Doesn't matter what the race is, what the series is, it gets your full attention and full passion.
Yeah. Otherwise, don't do it, because there's 1,000 people who would love the opportunity. I've been very, very fortunate since I left university to work in stuff that I find really interesting. And my broadcasting career, like, I would have happily taken an opportunity to commentate on almost any sport. I got so lucky that I got to commentate on my favorite sport. But I am aware that you can't ever phone it in, and you shouldn't, if you're able to, and I've been very fortunate in that regard, you shouldn't do something that you don't fully believe in and get motivated by. And so as a result, I love it. I love it because of the commitment showed. You can't ask the drivers to spend their lives practicing for this event and then turn up and not be, as I will be at the weekend, with notes papered across the desk. I tried to clean it up so it didn't ruin that beautiful studio that I used to commentate from. But and I tried to do a lot more on the laptop. But of course you're going to do your prep. Of course you're going to understand the motivations. Of course you're going to follow them on social media, see what they were doing in the week, see what their league racing results were. And then sometimes the producers are like, please, the producers would be a little bit like, or try and focus on the competition, but you'd know if they had a good week or a bad week. You'd know if they were trying to avenge something or whether they were trying to keep a run of momentum. And equally, it's close, exciting sport. If you can't get excited about close, exciting sport, don't pick the microphone up.
And that's a really key point, I think, is that sim racing is called sim racing because it's so one-to-one with real racing from a sporting perspective, right? And we can have all sorts of arguments, I'd rather not, about tire pressures and physics models and slip angles in sim racing, right? And
that's why I came on this podcast. Here we go, physics models. Let's go.
This is the one sim racing podcast where you will not hear us talking about that unless we're joking about the people that do. But anyway, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you went from real racing and then you got the opportunity to do sim racing commentary. But as you pointed out, the more common path perhaps might become sim racing and then into real racing. So now that you've done both, let's say you were given the opportunity to choose your successor, and you saw show reels from real commentators who have done real world series, whether that's sports car or the lower Formula series, and then you get a show reel from a sim racing commentator, and then let's say they've done ACC iRacing, they've done sports cars as well as Formula racing, and they show the same passion, the same preparation, the same narrative, the same storytelling. In your mind, what advantages does the real world commentator have for the role, if any?
Great question. I would say, off the top of my head, if I was going to put on I'm never going to be allowed to be an executive producer, so this is quite a fun game to play. The one thing I would say, what I love about it is the volume of work you can do with sim racing is enormous, right? The real world simply cannot put on the volume of action that you would be able to build up. The interaction with people in the paddock or other sports, the people behind so your football managers, your person who owns the club, your media managers, your PR representatives, that is a large part of telling the story. And if I was going to be, and this is being bluntly honest because the question was so good, I would want to be reassured that they knew how to conduct themselves in a paddock where they're not going to cause trouble for the channel or the broadcast. That would be it. The advantage they would have is that they would have so many reps. They would have so many laps. They would have so many scenarios, and they would have called so many close races and controversial moments. The advantage is that you're probably being exposed to the realities of a social media audience, which is absolutely part of this. You've got to take social media with you, whether you like it or not. You've got to bring them on the journey. You're probably being exposed to that in sim racing earlier than you would be for the real world stuff. Just on the breadth of emotional investment and the community. So they're probably the two balancing acts. So there's an advantage and there'd be a disadvantage, but that's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the idea of your conduct within the paddock being so important in this role. And I'd like to dive into that a bit more, because to me, that feels like just human behavior. Like, can you behave yourself? So if we could maybe pin down some specifics, is it things like not getting too big-headed because you're the commentator and you have the power to tell which stories you want, or knowing so much about the series that you criticize drivers or managers, or you take sides? Like, what sort of thing are you concerned about there?
So that would be more along the lines of when you go and you understand which teams are going to be fine with you, which teams are going to be tricky, how you deal with that. Remember, you are part of a process when you're in the paddock, as I am. It's the same with every single sport, where you are commentating for someone and producers who have meetings beyond your pay grade. You don't want to make your boss's life harder. And sometimes if you take a approach that doesn't take that into consideration, maybe a hot take too far, you're providing extra work for producers who are under the cosh and having to do work to a high standard week in, week out. Now, that is a extreme example, and I'm not casting any aspersions. I'm just saying that from a producer's point of view, the real world work would allow you to know, okay, they've interacted within this strange ecosystem of which top level sport takes place, where there's a balance to be found, right? You're not making these people happy with your work. That's not what you're doing. Don't misunderstand it. What you're doing is, from a producer's point of view, you need someone that you trust to find the balance, the limit. And if you're going to be critical to be critical in a way that you can stand it up if you're having a shouty conversation with an angry team on Monday morning. Now, that's a very extreme example, but that's part of broadcasting at a top level in any sport. That's not just motorsport, that's any sport. But equally, I don't want it to skew negative at all. I think this is the pathway. I think our motor racing commentators are going to come from this background coming forward, because that is just going to be the nature of both approaches. Are totally fine, but that's the one thing that maybe people should be aware of.
Well, let's just. So I want to go one level deeper with this, because I find this element of it fascinating, because I suppose it's the one element of sim racing commentary you can't possibly replicate, and that's the walking around the paddock, being in amongst the paddock. And now I know a few commentators who go and do local karting commentary, or they might even get some club racing commentary to try and learn. But for those who haven't had the opportunity to, I'd be interested to know more about your kind of in paddock preparation. We asked before about how much you prepare in terms of learning stats and storylines and relationships, etc. But I mean, okay, so I did a real world racing series a couple of years ago. It's tiny thing called Enduro Car, and it's Ford KAs, 40, 50 of them on the grid, and you race around for 6 hours at a time, teams of 4. So much fun, right? The cheapest racing you can possibly find. And I was surprised. I think Donington was my first race, and I turned up, and the first person that we saw who wasn't part of our team or engineers was the commentator, a guy called Adam Weller. He walked into the garage and started asking some questions about us and where we'd come from, and had we raced before, and why we were racing, and what was our sim racing link. And I thought this guy's really interested. Didn't realize he was a commentator. Yeah. And then someone said, "That's the commentator," and I realized he's got 6 hours to commentate on now. He's picking up as many little stories from the garages as he possibly can to go and commentate. And I'm wondering, in the world of F1, when everything is so kind of locked down and corporate, and there's 16 different types of access badges to get into all the different spaces, how much of that can you do?
It helps. So my approach is heavily weighted by the relationships I built when I encountered drivers, mechanics, team personnel in Formula 3, Formula 2, GP3, GP2 on the way up. So the early relationships, I would say, are quite important, and that's certainly informed the way I go about my job. And then Formula One is a very extreme example, but teams want to work with you, but there's a lot to be said for doing the ground game and doing exactly what you described. Because there might be a story there. If there's a long safety car, you can just bring a bit of light to a boring minute of the broadcast, or what would be a boring minute of the broadcast. And if you're improving the broadcast from where it roughly should be on average, you're doing a good job. And that's what that preparation was for. And also, the more you know, the more useful it is. Sometimes you know too much and you have to be like, all right, devil, do not say that out loud. So it's the regulation of information. I mean, I don't tend to go in for that too much. There's not a huge amount I know that I don't bring to the broadcast, because there's no point in indulging in gossip that you can't use on air, because that's just wasted prep time. So what can you use?
Nico Rosberg talking about buying Alpine because he just got a text from I think I was watching FP3 recently, which because for whatever reason, and there was clearly a lot of time to fill, and they were talking about text messages they'd had about buying shares in Alpine. I thought, well, this is an unusual insight into this world.
By the way, we're talking about the parameters of commentary and what rules apply and what rules don't apply. When you're a Formula One world champion, you can do whatever you like. All right. It doesn't. There are no broadcasting parameters that withhold you, as Mr. Rosberg has. I see the clips of when he's commentated on the F1 weekend, and you see the stuff that goes around, and there is a glorious liberation of someone who's been there and done that, who doesn't perhaps have to worry about upsetting people as much.
A James Hunt kind of style.
Exactly like that. Like that. Yeah.
Well, before we jump into our community questions, because there's more than usual here, and I'm conscious that we've already had a lot of your time, which we really appreciate. I just want to ask a question about the F1 game itself. Now, there is an option within this game to select you as the commentator. Now, A, that must be a really cool feeling, and B, it would be interesting to know the process, how the recordings are done, how the lines are selected, and are you given any visual cues? It'd be great to just hear about how that comes to life.
I have no idea how much I'm actually allowed to talk about this, because of course I just sign the contract and go and record. So I'll try and give you an insight and try and not upset my relationship with them. You record. So to go on the point of being an option to be chosen, that's honestly when they showed me the game after we'd done all the recording, and they showed me the game and they toggled across, and he was like, okay, you can select you and just see. I don't know. I remember going to get the game F1 99 for the PlayStation and like physically going to go and buy it, which makes me sound ancient, but and then the excitement to put the game in. I mean, it wasn't lost on me, and I think I'm 35. I've grown up with gaming. I've played all the F1 games. To be part of it was like, it was a real like, okay, don't let on that this is a big deal, but this is a really big deal. So everyone's looking at me in the room. Cool. Can we, move it on to something else so I don't get emotional? But it's a big deal. It's amazing to be a voice in the game. And that was special. Recording it takes days. It's not particularly revelatory. You have a real microphone. You have the real Coles microphone, the old school one. That was originally designed in the 1930s. They put you in a booth and you do hours of recording, hours and hours and hours of recording. And sometimes it's really interesting. What's been great is that it's moved away from, say, line A, say, line B. Here is line C. It's moved away from that. There's a lot more. I think you'll hear it. You should hear it in this year's game, where Alex Brundle and I were in doing the F2 mode at exactly the same time. So you got the actual riffing that you would get if you listen to us do a broadcast. So they're so good, that audio team, at trying to replicate the thing that Bahrain testing every single year. I always go out. I treat myself, because the rest of the year I'm obviously in the commentary box for every single session. I go out final day testing and just watch it, because I'm still a fan. I'll always be a fan. And they're there with the microphones. There they are, like 35 degrees. Everyone else is standing in the shade. They're at turn 1 with the microphone. They're at turn 3 with the microphone. They're at turn 10 with the microphone all day until it gets dark. So I love the commitment they put in there. And it's a lovely thing to be part of. And it genuinely means a lot to me.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it creates more fans, but also a different type of fan. And I've briefly mentioned this on previous episodes of our podcast, but I got into Formula One and racing in general because of the game. So back in 2000 and I think it was 11, the F1 2011, played the game, and before that, I had to go to my granddad's house on a Sunday and watch the Formula One. I was like, it's boring. It's just cars going round and round. So I don't get it. But then you play the game, and all of a sudden, every corner is a character, and the characters change in the wet and the dry, and the cars are different, and overtaking here isn't the same as overtaking there. And now I know what pit stop strategy is, and you watch it, and you're like, oh, I know what this is about. I do this. Obviously, it's to a totally different level, although it's more and more simulated, right? You can get more and more immersed in that world, but it creates a kind of fan that believes in it a lot more because they've done it.
I completely understand that pathway. And I think we've had in the last couple of years, with so many different ways, with Formula One improving its digital offering, with Drive to Survive, with the journey that you just described, there are so many different ways in to discovering the sport that I think what a brilliant time to be involved in Formula One. Because I love hearing that you found it through the game, and then suddenly the things that you weren't appreciating, suddenly you had an understanding of. And I think that speaks to sim racing. We're talking about commentators being discovered, coming through this way. We're talking about fans having their journey. If I wasn't working on it this week, I'd be watching it, right? I discovered it by accident flicking through the channels. You discovered it by playing the game and having an appreciation for something that was on in the living room. A lot of people would have found it through Drive to Survive. You've got some people would have found it just as the next video that played on their YouTube playlist. I love that there's multiple different ways in, and I think that sim racing is definitely part of that. And when you've seen the sim guys then go and be very impressive in something like the Race of Champions and then apply it to the real world, that is where the commentator narrative senses are going off, because you're like, this would be the journey of this being another way into participating is fantastic.
Yeah, we've been very lucky to have esports drivers on the show, and I'm going to kick myself after this episode. I can't remember who it was, either Seb Job or Lucas Blakely who beat Sebastian Vettel in I think it was the rally stage of the Race of Champions in the real world. And
I think it was Lucas, because I remember my phone blowing up when I was on a romantic break with my wife, and I was like, he's done what? He's beaten Sebastian Vettel.
Wild, absolutely wild. To segue into a question that one of our members, King Kodiak, has asked. He says, do you feel that attitudes and acceptance of sim racing is changing within real world motorsport?
It's an interesting one. I think it depends who you ask, but I'm not one for being snobbish about anything. And in my experience, teams want drivers who are quick. And I just want to revise one thing, because I got into the nuances of your question by saying, what's the one thing that you'd want a sim racing commentator to have? Maybe the real world would have an example. If I got sent a show reel as an executive producer, and I believe the best broadcaster had come from a sim racing background, I'm picking the best broadcaster. That's the name of the game. And if you can show with your work that you have an ability to be exciting, display your passion, to impart the important information and show good editorial judgment, which you can do as a sim racing commentator, if you do that, you will go far. That is the name of the game. It is hard. A lot of it is luck. A lot of it is timing, but you will go far, and you can do that with that start. And I think that's a good thing, because more voices, different backgrounds. I mentioned I had to go and make a loss when I used to cover sport for BBC local radio, because we couldn't pay very much, and I was just looking to build up the show reel. Not everyone can make a loss, right? Not everyone is daft enough to spend 4 years of their life doing that. So I like that it's more accessible, that people can stream, that people can broadcast. I think attitudes to sim racing, No, look, if you're putting on a good broadcast, if you're putting on a good commentary, if you're putting on a good performance, what's not to like?
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And I think that's going to be very reassuring to our listeners. Okay, so we'll go through a few of these community questions, try and get through them as fast as we can. And then we have a quick fire round at the end, which with the same 5 questions that we ask every guest. So Casper asks, what would be your dream 3-person lineup for a race behind the mic?
Wow.
He hasn't specified if you're part of the 3, by the way, which is interesting.
No, then we'll I can get myself into trouble. So I'm gonna go with the commentary box that we'll have this weekend, which is me, Julian Palmer, and David Coulthard. There we go. Tick that off. Still got a job.
Yep. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I love Murray Walker because Murray Walker basically set the guidelines for how motorsport commentary was done. Not just from the enthusiasm, but I think the glass half full, explaining it in the way that a 10-year-old could do it, a 10-year-old could understand, and also be the voice of a broadcast that was going out to 10 million people. That was an amazing balancing act, and he was the Don of motor racing broadcasting. So he had a bit of, I think he had a big effect on everyone, whether they know it or not, when they pick up a mic.
Yeah. Paul Glover, in the spirit of trying to get you into trouble, some of these questions, honestly, have you met any heroes who have been a disappointment? And if you don't want to answer that, he said in 2. The other one is a classic. What's been your biggest achievement to date? So up to you which one you want to go with there.
Let's not get myself in trouble with that. I have to say, in Formula One, I used to be a student newspaper. I used to do a lot of film press conferences. Different story. Formula One, no, I don't. I'm trying to give honest answers. I'm trying to think if anyone's been tricky. Genuinely, because you have to get so many people around you in Formula One, because you have to get a team to work with you. You can't really be tricky and survive to be anyone's hero. Does that make sense? Like, you're not going to have the longevity if you're being a bit of a clown. So, no, I found everyone to be really accommodating. And so, all the heroes I've met in Formula One have been top class. That's the genuine truth. As dull as that is. And then what was the second one?
The second one was a classic. What would you say is your biggest achievement in your career so far?
The one that means the most, I mean, I don't know if there are big achievements or not, but the one that means the most was doing the Channel 4 broadcast for Silverstone 2021. There's a very small group of people who've done the British Grand Prix on free-to-air network TV in the UK. More people have been to the moon. That's what I wanted to do when I was a kid. And meant the world to. If you say that you want to be a commentator from when you're really, really young, and all of your family and all of your friends hear you say that, and they support you, and you get a chance to do it on network TV, you better do a good job for them, and it means a lot if you can get to the end of the broadcast, and it did mean a lot.
With a dry eye. Amazing. Okay, Ike Sky says, and we might have to discuss what this means. If you could Thanos snap something into reality across all of motor racing, sim and or real, what would it be, and what would you hope to achieve by it?
Wow. Well, I'd like to be able to increase participation. I'd like to be able to increase the range of people that get an opportunity to show their skill behind the wheel, whether it be sim racing, whether it be motor racing. In the real world, I'd like to see it become a little bit more accessible. It's obviously always been incredibly expensive to go motor racing. I'd just like to see a broader spectrum from grassroots level. Yeah, there you go. I like the fact as well that you thought you might have to explain the Thanos snap. I like that.
Well, I kind of guessed what it would mean, but I wasn't entirely sure. I was a little bit nervous.
I'm not that old, Tom. Come on now.
I don't know what it is. I'm 31. I don't know what a Thanos snap is. Honestly, every day in my office, I'm an outcast and a stranger. Everyone in the office is 6 years younger. Anyway, right. Next question. Monkey Matt says, how many of the great lines, e.g., last lap calling the winner across the line, are scripted in advance versus ad-libbed?
It's all ad-libbed. I might think about scenarios. So if you have Abu Dhabi 2021, you're obviously going to think about what elements you want to draw out if Lewis wins. You're obviously going to think about what elements you want to draw out if Max wins. That has to match what's going on. Also, I'll show you how scripting wouldn't work. I have no idea when the director is going to go to Charles Leclerc on that last lap. Right? He might go to him out of the Nouvelle chicane. He might go to him out of Tabac. He might go to him across the line, and you might have 90 seconds. You might get 30 seconds. So you'll have thoughts about it, but I like to. So yeah, you have thoughts about where it might happen. No one will believe this is the case, but I remember thinking with Hamilton and Verstappen in 2021, have a think what happens if they crash. I mean, it was obvious, there were moments of brinkmanship building to what eventually happened at Silverstone. So you go through scenarios and you go with like what you would want to avoid almost. And then that gives you the confidence to improvise at the moment. And then, so I might have a few bullet points written down that have come to me, but they're sketched out in appalling handwriting. And then otherwise you do disservice to the audience because they'd be able to tell. And sometimes you go back, oh man, can you not have spoken in the English language slightly more brief? So sometimes you kick yourself for it, but I think it fits with the moment better if you do it that way.
So a follow-up question from me then. Have you ever had a moment in commentary where you've either thought, I don't know what to say next, there's an awkward moment of silence, or you've watched it back and gone, I'm not sure if that was the right thing to say?
Yeah, you definitely. So I don't think you should review all the time because then you just live in this broadcasting loop. But I do think you obviously have to go back and, if you're asking everyone else to listen to your work, you're going to have to go and listen back to it yourself. So in the breaks, in the weeks where, so we've had a week in between, I've watched back a ton of stuff from this year and gone, okay, you need to do that slightly differently, do that differently. I've never been short of what to say next, Tom. No, that has never come up. So yeah, I will let you know if it ever does.
That sounds like a prerequisite of a commentator's very nature. Okay, let's finish on a sim racing question. Pran asks, have there been any moments in the F1 Esports Series that you found fascinating whilst in the comms box?
Almost all of it. I have to say, I was dropped in the COVID year, virtual Grand Prix before I did so you had all these celebs taking part and some F1 drivers before we got to the F1 Esports situation. Yeah, I love seeing it. I'd say the thing I find the most fascinating is the driver's journey, how you can improve when the margins are so tight and you know that everyone else is spending every waking hour practicing. I love seeing how someone can make a leap forward and how someone can improve when it is fine margins. And yeah, drivers' journeys that's an appealing part of, or athletes' journeys is an appealing part of any sports broadcast. And that's what I think I find the most fascinating. And also learning, that it does come down to hours and hours and hours of repetition. And you've got to show a real personal hunger to be that dedicated, I think.
Yeah, and I love that you refer to them as athletes there. I was lucky enough to go to the Red Bull factory and interview their driver roster for this year. And I remember Sebastian Job discussing the pains that he gets in his shoulders from just hours and hours and hours of just force feedback. That they do more turning of the wheel than a real world driver, right? It's wild. Okay, Alex, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've loved every minute of it. And if I'd like to finish on our quick fire round, 5 questions, no hesitation, no thinking, just bang, 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 bang. So first question. Some of these are outrageous. First question. Best motorsport moment of all time?
For me, Mika Häkkinen getting past Michael Schumacher, Belgium 2000.
Mario Kart or iRacing?
Mario Kart.
Why do you love sim racing?
Because it's so close that it always comes down to a thrilling finish.
Why does sim racing suck?
I don't think it does.
Good. Who should we invite onto the Sim Sundays podcast next?
Ooh. Well, I worked a lot with Tom Deacon and Matt Gallagher. So if you haven't had them, Nicholas Hamilton was also part of the team when I was lucky enough to be doing it. He's got an incredible story and is a top bloke. So they're 3 names for you.
Great. Thank you very much. Alex, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate how much you've given us. And thanks a lot. Great to have you.
Great to be part of it. And to any wannabe commentators out there, keep pushing at it. And you've got a path with sim racing to get to anything you might want to dream of. So keep pushing at it and show the dedication. And I promise you good things will happen.
Well, that was Alex Jacques on the Traction Sim Sundays podcast. An entertaining episode. I think we both agreed that going into it anyway, but listen to it again. Wonderful. Amazing how he keeps sim racing and motorsport on a level with each other. But also, just his work ethic and research. Fascinating, right?
Yeah, the guy's super driven. He's very inspirational. I think for any aspiring commentators listening, I think they're taken a lot away from that it's hard work, but it's hard work driven by passion, right? There's a note in there about how your research before each race is your safety net. And I remember thinking, well, if you're massively into sim racing or motorsport, researching it is it's not an arduous task, right? Well, perhaps it's arduous. Perhaps there's a lot of detail that you want to bring out, but it's going to be something that you're going to enjoy doing anyway. And that really shone through, and it was great to see him applying that equally to sim racing and real world racing.
Yeah, and also I think we should touch upon his interest still for Formula 2. You think, he's got the Formula 1 gig. See you later, junior Formula, but that's not the case. And actually, how that still informs his Formula 1 work. I thought was extremely enlightening because, he's got the extra knowledge and context to certain drivers that maybe other commentators don't have.
Totally. I feel very blessed to have had that conversation. And if you enjoyed our episode with Alex Jacques, please consider leaving us a positive review on Spotify and or YouTube. It does help us to find new audiences and get guests on the show. Feel free to join us in the TraxionGG Discord, where we chat about all the news stories that Tom and the team at TraxionGG break on a daily basis, and where we ask you guys for questions whenever we have our confirmed upcoming guests for the Sim Sundays podcast. And as always, thank you to our podcast sponsor, Elgato. Until next time, see you later.
Welcome to the paddock.
Welcome to the paddock. Keep it
Bye.
pinned.
Keep it pinned.